Greetings, everybody. This is Christopher Messina coming at you from the Messy Time Studios. Another beautiful day here in the wintertime in Florida. It's the 4th of November, 2022. I am delighted and honored to be joined today by Dr. Harvey Risch, who I will let him give his background, but he is another graduate of the University of Chicago, so we intimately and instantly trust his opinion. So, Harvey, thanks for coming on the show.
Pleasure to be with you.
So very briefly, I think I came across your work because of my interest in trying to get people to understand the truth about the Wuhan virus. Maybe you give a little bit about your background and kind of what your thoughts on this have been the last couple of years. We could take it from there.
Okay. I did my undergraduate work at Caltech and got a very intense science and appreciation of science kind of undergraduate curriculum experience there. Went to medical school. After medical school, in medical school, I did basically at UC San Diego, we had the thesis requirements. I spent a lot of time in the lab doing experiments. And then after I graduated, I went and got a PhD in the University of Chicago in mathematical modeling of infectious epidemics. And I published a paper on that. And then I did a postdoc in mainstream epidemiology at University of Washington. Took my first job in Canada in Toronto, working in a cancer epidemiology research group. I learned all my field methods and how to do these kinds of studies there, and much more about epidemiologic principles in the real world. And then 1991 came to Yale, became professor of epidemiology there, and just this last July became professor emeritus of epidemiology. What happened in the COVID period is that I'm a member of the Connecticut Academy of Science and Engineering. We formed a committee to help the governor with ideas to reopen the state of Connecticut after its lockdown. And so the governor already had a committee. So our committee was the alternate universe scientist people, basically to think outside the box. So there was me, there was my dean, Stan Vermund, who is an epidemiologist and physician. There was a clinical psychologist, a couple physicists, a cardiologist, a jet airplane engineer who knows all about air motion and stuff like that. And so we all had some interesting ideas about things. And my task in this committee was to look at outpatient treatment. And that's how I got into the hydroxychloroquine business, because I surveyed everything that was out there that I could find on the two drugs that were being examined at the time, hydroxychloroquine and remdesivir. And
just a quick clarification, at what time period is this? When is this happening?
So this is April, May of 2020.
Okay, so right as all this is kicking off and they're experimenting with lockdowns and right in the thick of it. Okay.
Yes. And so I did my thorough job as a scientist and wrote an extensive paper that was published in the American Journal of Epidemiology. It was peer-reviewed by the other editors of the journal as an internally peer-reviewed manuscript. I made changes to it at their recommendations. That was what was published. It got a lot of views and downloads. It's the highest viewed paper in the history of the American Journal of Epidemiology, which is over 100 years old.
That's a really cool footnote.
Yeah, and stirred up a lot of initial controversy. And the bizarre thing about this is, as a scientist, I should say that I've taught epidemiology, especially advanced research methods in epidemiology, for close to 40 years. And the one complaint that students make about epidemiology when they first get into it is it's too nitpicky. That's what they call it, nitpicky.
Too nitpicky. How dare you focus on details so closely?
Right. Now, can you imagine somebody in chemistry saying, this is too nitpicky? Or in physics, I'm sorry, this is too nitpicky. So what people don't understand is epidemiology is a mathematical discipline with biological knowledge and medical knowledge. But underlying it is math and statistics. And that's nitpicky, and so if you don't like that, you're in the wrong field. You'll
love this. My statistics professor used to refer to statistics as the blue collar work of mathematics, because you spend all your time shoveling data around and getting it clean before you can do anything with it.
Now, statistics does have its theoretical section, which is very important because that's where the assumptions are, and assumptions are everything, basically. the data will fit what you assume to be right. So
Right. Hence the Reverend Bayes cautioned us about that.
that's right, right. In any event, so I wrote this paper and I got pushback against some other paper that basically the pushback was hydroxychloroquine doesn't work. Well, but here are 5 studies of varying degrees of quality, all saying the same thing, that it does work. And so they started saying, well, here the studies in the hospital show it doesn't work, so therefore it doesn't work at all.
And who is this voice of they saying that the work you've done to prove that this is effective is in quote unquote in fact ineffective? Who are these voices saying no?
Oh, Fauci at the top.
Well, yeah.
Fauci responded explicitly to being asked about this. He waved his hand away and said, "Oh, it's just anecdotal evidence." Okay,
Wow.
which is a lie, because anecdotal evidence means, and he knows this perfectly well, means a case series of 1 or 2 cases.
Right.
Okay, there's your anecdotal evidence. A case series of 50 cases is not even anecdotal evidence. That's the case half of a case control study, which is an observational study, which is not anecdotal evidence. So
Right.
he knows perfectly well what he said was misrepresentation.
Hmm.
Any event, it was covered to a very short degree in major media. I was on, what was his name? John, I forgot his name, on CNN, who tried to bully me on air, and
Right.
and basically insisted that not only did randomized trials constitute the only form of medical evidence worth considering, but that they were all showed that this drug didn't work, and this was ludicrous, because it's, first of all, it's not true that randomized trials. In fact, randomized trials are not the pinnacle of evidence, and evidence-based medicine, which we'll talk about if you want, has been a misrepresentation from its outset in 1991. And in any event,
Well,
so
this actually, I want to back up because this is an important point for my listeners, because although I'm not a doctor, I am a statistician enough professionally that in January, February of 2020, I began to look at the numbers coming out of the Institutes of Health in Italy. And my reaction was, well, it's sad, but this thing seems to kill people over 95 who already have, or 85 who already have a significant illness. That used to be called life. Why are we losing our minds? So I'm curious about your take on that instant pushback from Fauci, that sort of attack on CNN. Where do you think this came from, where a group of people suddenly became ideologues rather than listening to evidence? I'm kind of curious about your point of view from being right in the middle of that as a professional, saying, well, this works, and then hearing it doesn't.
well, let me get to that, because there's something that people need to hear again. I've said this many times, other people have said it many times, which is that COVID is not one disease, it's at least 3 diseases. Just itself, not long COVID, just itself.
Right.
It starts with outpatient illness, which is a flu-like illness of viral replication. The standard signs and symptoms: sore throat, cough, sneezing, runny nose, headache, fever, loss of sense of smell, tiredness. Those are all the things that people get when they get colds and flu.
Right.
In some people, by no means all, in some people, on somewhere around day 4 to 8, in that range, people decompensate when the immune system over responds in those individuals and fills up the lungs with immune system debris. That's acute respiratory distress syndrome, pneumonia, or like that, pneumonia. That's when people get hospitalized. Okay.
Right.
And that's the hospitalization stage of the disease. It's a totally different disease, requires different treatment. There's no reason to think that treatments in those people would work on the viral replication phase, and vice
To
versa.
give people I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to give people a sense as you're talking of those who got that first flu-like stage, as I got. What percentage of those move on to that secondary respiratory distress stage, or is that even a well-known percentage yet?
Well, in the original COVID, it was on the order of a few percent. Okay.
Single digits.
Probably in the single digits. Also, again, highly dependent on age and chronic illnesses and obesity.
Right.
Okay. And then there's a third stage in hospital disease, which is the disseminated immune reaction, that not just in the lungs, it's the virus and the immune response everywhere in every organ in the body, which is a catastrophic illness. that the virus had no actual interest in doing, because that doesn't get it out to spread to other
Right.
people.
Kills the host, it can't spread, so that's not part of its quote unquote
Right.
its desire to spread.
Right. So as I said, the treatments are different. This has been widely published, widely understood, except by the people who want to misrepresent the science of this illness. Now remind me your question again.
So the you had said there are three stages to what's called COVID or Wuhan virus. I can't stop calling it. My question was more about having been involved in this now for a couple of years and having your background directly in epidemiology, statistics, all that. Well, two questions. One is, has it ever before occurred in your career that politicians and media or just other groups outside of medicine take a highly politicized, stringent, kind of authoritarian view of saying this is what's correct, and whether or not this is the first time this has happened? What is your perception of the motivations of Fauci and others who kind of fought against rationality to scream at us all and tell us to shut up? And I'm just kind of curious, from a medical perspective, why do you think that happened, or do you have any idea? Is it just a bafflement?
I can provide you some evidence about things and their timeline. So in September or October of 2019, the Minister of Health in France changed the status of hydroxychloroquine from over-the-counter to prescription only. She did this by making the bizarre and false statement that chloroquine, its original form that was used it's still in use, but for 65 years, was somehow genotoxic. That means it does genetic damage to the person who takes it. Well, hundreds of millions of people in tens of billions of doses have taken chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine over this time. It is understood to be one of the safest medications in the world. It's safer than aspirin and so on. And yet there was this ridiculous change in status by someone who was very well connected to the medical establishment and pharma. Her husband was head of INSERM, that's the European Scientific Research Agency organization. He was present at the 2017 opening of the Wuhan Institute of Virology BSL-4 lab.
Wow.
So this is a very well pharma-connected, virus vaccine community connected individual who did this change in status. Then the next bizarre thing that happened was in early February of 2020, a paper appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine entitled "The Magic of Randomization versus the Myth of Real-World Evidence." And this paper
Curious timing.
Curious timing. Must have been written in January, before anybody knew that there was a pandemic coming, except maybe a few people in China and Italy.
Right.
And this paper, which was written by 4 very eminent medical statisticians in UK, all of whom have major funding from pharma, wrote this paper, which was an entire screed against my field, epidemiology, and made the bizarre, ridiculous assertion that randomization automatically makes every randomized trial high quality evidence, and everything that's not randomized is anecdotal, so to speak, is not worthy of consideration.
Right.
Now, I'm in the middle of trying to finish a paper on the overall picture of this, which is we have not been fed any science for the last 3 years on COVID. It has all been plausibility. We have been fed plausibility message after plausibility message. And to say that randomized trials, randomization is perfect, is another one of those plausibility messages. And this plausibility message actually comes about from much further in the past. It comes from the start of evidence-based medicine in 1991, when that discipline was founded, so to speak. But it even precedes that. It starts with.
Well, let's break it for a second, because I think people would find that fascinating, right? I think kind of generally educated listeners who feel they have a somewhat of a grip on the scientific process would be startled to hear that 1991 was the starting point for something called evidence-based medicine. Right?
Well, but that title's a fraud. I mean,
right.
this is my point, that it's a misrepresentation of saying, do you think that medical evidence suddenly appeared with people doing clinical trials in 1991? Do we not have vaccines and medications tried and true, long in use in medical history, going back 50 or 100 or 1,000 years? Of course we did.
So this is kind of an ideological land grab in the medical sciences. Is that how you characterize that?
Yes.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yes, exactly. And you can understand who the supporters of that were. The financial supporters, again, pharma.
Right.
Okay.
Where does the money go? Who profits from that distinction being made and accepted?
Okay. So you have to realize that randomized trials are very expensive. That basically you either get a large grant from NIH to do one, because NIH has some vested interest in what they want studied. Those are not common. Or you get funded by pharma, and you're basically doing the trial for pharma as a pharma apparatchik.
Sure.
Okay, and that's the great majority of them. And that means that the pharma people have control over everything about that trial. And because of all of the shenanigans and chicanery that pharma has done on randomized trials for so long, the federal government was forced to step in at various points. For example, it created, I think in 1997, the clinicaltrials.gov registry that for clinical trials involving serious or life-threatening diseases and their treatments, that doctors were required to, or the trialists were required to register all the details of their trial on this registry. And in fact, it is almost tantamount to FDA approving the trial to get it into the registry. And that's been the case. The registry was put online in 2000, and the trials are registered there. And the reason for that was to stop pharma from doing a dozen randomized trials, finding the one that was beneficial by chance and only reporting that.
Right. So you're not allowing success bias to creep into the data. We say all of these studies were done, 2 out of 90 showed something useful. Then that knowledge is useful and significant to people making judgment. Okay.
Right. So anyway, the issue of randomization goes back to Sir Ronald Fisher, who was the eminent statistician from which we have crop rotation, we have tests of crop rotation. We have a lot of basic statistical theory. The F test in statistics is named after him, and so on. He was in favor of randomized trials. And then in I think it was 1925, the Polish statistician Jerzy Neyman said, if a trial isn't randomized, I don't think it's worth even thinking about. So this is a long history of plausibility of people who just aren't paying attention. David Sackett, who was one of the main moving forces at McMaster University in Ontario, said in 1996 that basically evidence-based medicine is about combining doctors' clinical experience with the best available evidence. Now, that's already wrong on both counts. And it's, again, another plausibility statement. If you combine a single doctor, your own personal experience, that is anecdotal. You need to have a generalized idea of what clinicians are seeing in the field to be able to make generalized statements. And secondly, limiting your analysis to the best available evidence means there's subjectivity in what you consider best.
The best available evidence. That sounds suspiciously like all the news that's fit to print.
That's right. That's right. The correct statement should have been that you take all the evidence that's out there, you weigh it subjectively according to standards of evidential reasoning, and you come up with a synthesis to draw your conclusions. This is what Sir Austin Bradford Hill did published in 1965. That's formed the basis in all those years of how epidemiologists reason about causation in associations that we observe.
This, I have a feeling this is one of the most fascinating, in-depth discussions we could ever have. But I'd like to bring it back to the implications of that declaration in the New England Journal of Medicine of February 2020.
Exactly, yes.
What that kind of shot across the bow meant for how COVID was treated subsequently by firstly governmental officials who we've come not to trust, and those who are kind of banging their heads against the wall saying, here's rationality and reason, why is no one listening?
So let me just say one quick thing about, don't take my word for why this is plausibility and not science. If you flip a coin 10 times, you're likely to get 7 heads and 3 tails, or vice versa, by chance, right?
Yep, by chance, yep.
Okay, now a 7 to 3 split is more than a twofold difference. And that means if you have a randomized trial that only has 10 subjects, 10 outcome subjects in the treatment arm or the placebo arm, it could have a factor that split more than twofold in those subjects that was not removed by randomization. And what epidemiologists know and statisticians and everybody else don't seem to know is that that's called confounding.
Right.
And confounding occurs because of the magnitude of the split, the 7-3, and not because of whether it happened by chance. So all these people,
why a large N is always better for any observational
let me just
study.
say that you read these randomized trials, and the third column is the probability, the p-value, the statistical chance that the treated and placebo subjects differed. That is totally irrelevant. What matters is how much they differed by. And in small trials, they can differ by a lot, and it's meaningful, and the trial is useless. And this is just a total misrepresentation to ignore this fact in randomized trials. And the problem is that, for example, the first trial of the Pfizer vaccine on 20,000 treated people and 20,000 placebo people had the outcome was, I think, symptomatic infection. There were 162, I believe, infections in the placebo people and 8 in the vaccine people. So this sounds like it did a really good job, except for one thing, that those 8 people are not randomized. And therefore, and this is published in the New England Journal, it should be published in the New England Journal of Mendacity, that this is
how
not,
often have you delivered that line? That's good.
A few times. that this is a misrepresentation of the science, that randomization only works when the numbers of outcome events are more than 50 or 100 in each group. And otherwise, it's junk science. And that was junk science because of that reason. And this is the fraud that evidence-based medicine has been pushing since its inception, that only randomized trials are evidence, and they don't have to be large. They can be what they call the 20,000 and 20,000 makes them large, and that's nonsense. What matters is the outcomes.
Right.
And so that's the problem that we've been facing, this misrepresentation of what science is, and the reliance on these things. It's plausibility, but it's not true. That's all. And so when did this creep in? This paper was published in early February of 2020. It means it had to be written in January of 2020.
At least, yeah.
Right? Before anybody really knew there was a pandemic coming, except for the pharma people who knew there was a pandemic coming.
Right.
Why did they do it? Because what's the point of randomized trials? They cost a huge amount of money, and only pharma can do them, essentially. And because of that, they knew that generic medications could not be approved without randomized trials. This was their statement, the shot across the bow of, in order to establish that something works, you have to do a randomized trial, and we control the randomized trials because the generic medications don't have big profit margins. So their manufacturers are not going to put up the 10 or $50 million to do a randomized trial in order to show that they have some benefit, which they do. And therefore, and they knew that the FDA would not approve medications for use under the emergency use authorization rules unless there was randomized trial evidence, which the FDA actually said. And
that's actually an interesting point to focus on. So your normal run-of-the-mill American, hopefully it's most of us, would assume that kind of objective scientific best practice standards would inform, if not drive, decisions at places like the FDA for the best outcomes to the American people. But what you're saying is, because of an ideological bent that was promulgated by people with a financial interest in a certain type of standard being the one that's used, when multiple potential standards could be applied, they kind of put their thumb on the scale of what is going to be politically acceptable evidence when something really terrible like a pandemic comes out. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, the FDA has been putting its thumb on the scale for 20 or more years, at least, that we know about. There have been investigations. It's been on both sides of the political spectrum. Each side has complained about FDA decisions. The FDA gets 2/3 of its funding from pharma, user fees, they call them. And the FDA routinely calls pharma its clients. not the American people,
Of the
but
American
pharma.
people. Well, here's a quick question. I think this is important because I think a lot of folks kind of my ideological bent or having looked at this would have heard stories of American people screaming that, my kid's got a certain horrible disease and there have been enough trials done that I'm willing to roll the dice. He's going to die in 6 months, so I'd like to use it. But the FDA is blocking because, so in that instance, Big Pharma would clearly like to push the drug out. You've got people clamoring for it, but the FDA is blocking it. So that would seem to run counter to the idea that they're standing there they're standing there as shills for Big Pharma when there are instances of Big Pharma saying, look, we'd like to give this drug out and you're not letting us do it. So is there an inherent contradiction there, or am I just looking at it the wrong way?
Most of that clamor has been for generic drugs, is my understanding, that the high-priced patent drugs, FDA has no problem making a show of looking at evidence and pushing through, making corrupt committees for review, as we've seen during the COVID period, that in the original remdesivir hydroxychloroquine panel, it had 54 members, 18 had pharma conflicts of interest. Only half of those disclosed them. The other half were basically hid them.
Right.
And then later in the summer, Fauci convened another committee for re-reviewing hydroxychloroquine. It had 20 members, 11 of them, a majority of them had pharma conflicts of interest. The whole absurdity of this. The problem was that these generic medications would not be approved by FDA. This led in 2016 to Congress trying to override that by passing the 21st Century Cures Act.
Right.
This is a very, very comprehensive document law that in one section 3022 says that regulatory agencies should use all relevant evidence and not just randomized trial evidence. And then, so comes to COVID, the Henry Ford investigators they had been using hydroxychloroquine successfully, asked FDA to approve it in emergency use authorization. The FDA twice said no, and they sent back a letter saying, we'll only do this when there are multiple randomized trials showing benefit.
But this is formerly a generic over-the-counter drug that's been used for 6 decades, and suddenly the FDA is not allowing a doctor to exercise his or her judgment to use it?
Well, in the United States, it's prescription only,
okay.
But it's approved.
France.
It's an approved medication that doctors can use off-label anytime they want. 85% of drugs used today are off-label. That this is a discussion between the doctor and the patient. The doctor, doctor's not going to prescribe generic medications that profit almost nobody for a reason that he thinks is unlikely to work because either there's no benefit and the patient could get worse and not get treated. So there's an investment of everybody that this should work, and the only one who has an investment for it not to work is pharma, who's making an expensive competing product.
Right.
And so you have the FDA basically corrupt, and the corruption that is still there to this day. That every time I wake up and think, am I off the wall? Am I crazy in everything in this pandemic? I just go to the FDA.
Well, that's a common feeling many people have in dealing with the government.
Right.
You get that lurking sensation that someone's not making a lot of sense, and I hope it's not me.
Right. So I just go to the FDA's webpage to show me that it's still there and they're still lying. The FDA on July 1st of 2020 put out a website page saying, warning, hydroxychloroquine is unsafe to be used for outpatient treatment of COVID. This does not apply to rheumatoid arthritis or lupus or other diseases where it's been in use for decades, and so on, only to COVID.
Right. And what's its main action? What does it do? Is it an anti-inflammatory? What does it actually do?
It's an immune modulator, and it has a number of different effects. Let me get to that after I talk about this website.
I'm just curious, just in generic terms, for people to understand why you present with these symptoms, your doctor would think, I should prescribe this to you. It works in these areas, so it should work here off-label, quote unquote.
Empirical, but anyway, so in fine print underneath this big bold black letter warning, it says we base this warning on one study of hospitalized patients.
Wow.
Now, as I've told you, hospital disease is a totally different disease with different treatment than outpatient disease, and so and if the FDA says that, it means they didn't have any evidence of damage in outpatient use, because They would have cited that. If they had systematic evidence showing adverse events of hydroxychloroquine usage in outpatients, they would have cited that in the
Right.
warning.
So this one study of hospitalized patients with the third variant of this disease and nothing else is what has informed 2 years of celebrities trying to shut down Joe Rogan and everybody else who talks about I took this and I feel better.
So what this did is it prevented hydroxychloroquine from being given the emergency use authorization status, which
Right.
would have allowed the government to open the strategic national stockpile of 60 some million doses of hydroxychloroquine, which would have sent it around the country, which would have gotten I mean, it's a very cheap and easily obtainable medication. And it's in use so much. There's one fraud after another. Oh, then the rheumatoid arthritis patients won't get any, as if it couldn't, a million doses a day couldn't be made,
Right.
easily. And in any event,
So they
so
just kept shifting
now,
arguments, hoping that one of them would stick. What a great
right,
idea. I'm not
right.
going to treat some people with something to make them feel better because some other hypothetical group of people might not be able to get the drug. That sounds very Soviet.
Not only is it Soviet, it's false. But in any event,
An
so
added benefit. It's a lie.
the problem is that had they used this medication in outpatient use, it would have saved approximately 3/4, at least, of the patients who died from COVID.
That's
So,
horrifying.
right. So that means 1 million patients over the first year and a half or 2 years of this pandemic in the United States. About half of them or are probably maybe a little less, 40% now, died from COVID as opposed to with COVID. And of those, it would have saved upwards of 3/4. So 300,000 people, maybe at least, would
And
not
that
have died.
analysis is yours. That's consensus with other epidemiologists. I was kind of curious for my listeners, kind of how broadly analyzed and disseminated and agreed upon is that posture that this number of people would have been saved had we done something different.
It is the irrefutable conclusion of all of the studies that have examined hydroxychloroquine usage and risks of hospitalization and mortality. Outpatient early usage and risk of mortality. There's 10 studies, I believe now, 9 studies that involve more than 40,000 patients in total, all over the world. That I've done a summary of this. It's on the earlycovidcare.org website that anybody can download the document as a brief.
We'll put that in the link, earlycovidcare.org.
Right. And it shows the reduction in risk of mortality of 75% of these studies. These are range from small to large studies. Every one of them shows benefit, and so on. And that's basically the evidence for why this medication reduces the risk so much of mortality. There's no question, scientifically speaking. Now, the only way to push back is to say, oh, all those non-randomized studies don't count. They're weak studies, poor quality studies, and therefore only the randomized studies. The randomized studies are a joke. When Boulware's study in Minnesota that he did by internet, where you can't even tell that the people are real who enrolled in the study.
Right.
And he had no deaths in the entire randomized trial. He had one hospitalization. Well, a randomized trial that has one hospitalization, whichever arm it's in, is nonsense. Okay.
Yeah. Well, this speaks to a broader theme, which I have found, again, not as a medical professional, but certainly as someone who understands statistics. I got into a huge screaming fight with someone I was on a kind of a shared board with. He is a medical doctor, and he had put something up on LinkedIn. I forget what it was, but it was basically the article was, masks are effective. Anyone telling you otherwise is lying. And he cited a study. And in the study itself, run by the CDC, if you read it, it states there is absolutely no correlation between wearing a mask and the outcomes of whether you got this disease or passed it out or not. So you've got someone who's did not even bother to read the thing his assistant handed to him. It was bizarre to read that they put a headline on this thing that he put his name to, and the actual document itself refuted the statement at the head of the headline. It's been a baffling couple of years for rationality.
That's correct. So much what the CDC has written and articles on the Morbidity Mortality Weekly Report, its in-house non-peer-reviewed journal, has been fatally flawed. That particular study, I believe that's the Kentucky study.
I just remember reading it again, having some fluency in statistics. I could read the statistical, all footnotes, tiny little print, and all of them said it indicated no statistical significance whatsoever to any one of the various groups they apportioned. It was nuts. I couldn't
Well, the
believe I was
problem is
reading
that they cherry-picked Kentucky. Okay, they had data from multiple states, and they picked the one that they wanted to make the claim that it had some relationship.
Right.
One of the major problems is that reporters pick the last sentence of the abstract to quote,
Right.
and the papers have invariably had false last sentences of the abstract. Basically, the Bulwer study that showed no evidence whatsoever on hospitalization risk. What the investigators said, and this study shows no benefit of hydroxychloroquine. Well, that's absurd. It didn't show that. This study was not able to have enough subjects by design in order to tell whether there was a benefit of hydroxychloroquine. It's the proper conclusion, not that it shows no benefit. And this is so you understand how this system has worked to corrupt medical evidence, medical knowledge, foist plausibility on everybody, and claim that it's science. And when Fauci's saying, "I am the science,"
That was one of the
science.
greatest things in the history of anything. I am science. Oh my, are we now? How
Right.
exciting.
And you, the emperor, have no clothes. Right.
Exactly. Well, this is fascinating. I think what would be very helpful is, because the folks who are listening to Messy Times for a bit of enlightenment, right? They're very interested in diving into details and very interested in hearing kind of rational expertise and why some of the things they've been hearing are complete lies, and what are the motivations of those lies. If you had to kind of summarize really quickly, if you had just a couple of minutes, what are the most massive things you would suggest people who really want to take a look back at this? Because and the reason I'm saying it is, there was this article that came out in the Atlantic a couple of days about someone who's like, why don't we have some amnesty? Why don't we all just forgive each other for the things we said during the Wuhan Panic? Well, for those of us who were screaming from day one that school lockdowns made no sense, the lockdowns were immoral and were nonsense. I mean, we live in the free state of Florida, so to us, this is largely theoretical. But I go other places in the country, it was craziness, right? So for those of us who are like, no, there's no amnesty. You did massive damage to people, especially children. And now, of course, you're saying, oh, well, we didn't know. But there are those of us who certainly did know. So kind of what do you say to people who are kind of not sure about that argument and would like to really find a way of looking at evidence to say, God, Fauci was lying his ass off the entire time?
Ignorance of the law is no excuse.
That's good.
Right.
That's solid.
Okay, this person had a career of 20 years of murdering people he knew. Oh, all right, we'll just not prosecute. That's okay. We just want to all get along. I think that the writer of that article is morally obtuse.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a given. But she's
know,
just the voice of an entire political class that would like this to go away. And
well,
my
they caused
mantra has
that.
been, we will never let these people declare victory, because then they could say it, quote unquote, worked, when all they did was disastrous damage.
Right. I mean, it's very venal for her to say that because they're the ones who inflicted the damage.
Yep.
And then to somehow say we want to be absolved of that responsibility after we inflicted it on you, the country, is just venal self-interest and nothing more, under the guise of doing good, and everything about them is virtue signaling, doing good anyway. So, there's no meat there. There's no rational reason there. There's no justice. If we, as a just society, need to move on, we need to find a way of bringing some degree of justice and responsibility to end the malfeasance of what happened. And I think that if we don't do that, we've lost all moral standing in our eyes of ourselves as what we stand for in the United States and in the world. I mean, the question has been, there have been lots of genocides in the world. How many of them have actually punished the perpetrators? The answer to that is not heartening, because
not many.
Not that many. Okay, but the rest of the world is not the United States. There's lots of third world in the rest of the world, and we, as as an idealistic nation who wants to take rights and responsibilities seriously, have to come. We have a system of justice. The system of justice has to play itself out in this. And in order to figure out who knew what, when, and did, you have to, as they say, follow the money. Who stood to gain? There's pharma stood to gain. Everything was in their interest by promotion of fear and compliance, and force mandated everything. That was all aligned in one direction. There was a political benefit to be made, even though it was idiotic to think. So all this was going on before Trump said anything.
Yep.
Trump started talking about hydroxychloroquine in March. They knew that this was coming in fall of 2019.
And they were all lined up to start screaming that he's lying and he doesn't know what he's talking about, and it's insane.
Right.
The talking points were exactly the same. Whatever channel you turned on, it was exactly the same script.
Right. Now, the strange thing is there was released some documents in the last few days from FOIA materials that appear to show that the National Security Council took control of the pandemic and appointed FEMA to run it. Now, the interesting thing about that is that one can see the rationality of doing that for shipping supplies all around the country.
Right.
Maybe not
that FEMA showed a great deal of logistics expertise and the things that are actually in their bailiwick.
True. But in any event, there's a rationality for that. There's no rationality for them making policy. We don't know where all the policy authority came from. However, it does appear that Deborah Birx was appointed by NSC or moved into her position by NSC.
Highly likely.
And one should read her book to see the amount of hubris in the admissions of what she did for the reasons that she did.
Her hubris is flashier than her scarves.
Yes. Her reasoning about why she formulated the policies that she did is we hoped they would work.
Wow.
That's the nature of science for her. That's what she says.
We hoped it would work.
Hoped it would work.
I'm on my comfy government salary, unimpacted by any of this. I hope if we shut the entire economy down and people who don't get to work from home on laptops get damaged irreparably, well, maybe it'll work. That's great. Thanks, Deborah.
Well, that's the instrumentality notion of the worth of human life, that we doctors have, primum non nocere, first do no harm, a Nuremberg code, all of our human experimentation codes that came after Nuremberg, the Belmont Report, 45, CFR 46, and so on, that we all have traditionally had to go through. Every time we do a study involving human beings, we have to go through our institutional review boards, the human subjects boards, to demonstrate that no harm will come to the people who participate in our studies. And these are very extensive documents that we work up and so on. Is this suddenly just out nowhere? When you vaccinate 200 million people, you don't have to give them informed consent. You don't have to do anything. Suddenly,
if you threaten them and taking away their jobs, they don't take a jab they don't need.
Right. That the problem is that this was instrumentalized on a war footing, and the public health has through the CDC, a traditional military mentality. We have a Surgeon General who's a general. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, when you're at war, does a country question the progress of the war? It says you shouldn't attack Leningrad. You should attack Moscow. I mean, that would be absurd because we, the people, don't have that knowledge. But in science, we do, and the authority for investing public health in a military enterprise is limited by the quality of the evidence that they bring to bear. And when it's weak and directed not in our interest, but in pharma interest, then we have a really big problem. And let me just return to one thing which is, I know that you like to call this the Wuhan virus.
Yes, and I do so for a very specific reason, which is important. Is that as a University of Chicago originalist, that was the first name given to it because it originated in the city of Wuhan. And the Chinese Communist Party went and screamed at everyone that that was racist and somehow implicated them. And I grew up in a Cold War household, and anything communists tell me not to do, I will do. And so it is not because I like Donald Trump for any reason. It is merely because no one went out and beat people up in Colorado because they caught Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and no one beats people up in Connecticut because they caught Lyme disease. That's why I call it the Wuhan virus.
So I don't disagree with that reasoning, but I would point out that we don't actually know what originated means. Originated might mean the place where it first got released
Sure,
into the population,
fair enough.
but we don't know that that was its only source of creation, that the engineering that went into its creation did not just occur there. It
Ah,
may have
so is it
occurred.
the Wuhan Bethesda virus? To be somewhat facetious.
Yes, yes, that this is what I'm driving at,
Right.
that there's enough evidence now to know that this was a proven engineered virus from a much less invasive, harmful precursor virus
Huh.
beyond statistical chance. There's no chance. And the reason for this is that there's a sequence in the genetic code of the spike protein that's crucial for the infectivity of the virus.
Hmm.
And that sequence is not just 12 nucleotides long, as people have been asserting, it's 19 nucleotides long. And that sequence is found in a patented gene in a Moderna patent starting in 2013.
Oh
And,
my.
and Moderna has never explained how that so-called coincidence has occurred.
Huh.
And it's impossible statistically.
Well, in terms of nomenclature, I am wide open to an evidence-based change in terminology. I am not wide open to anything the Chinese communists tell me to do.
Oh, right. Because motivation counts. When I read papers, I always look to the conflicts of interest section first in order to know how skeptical I should be, whether I should just be scientifically skeptical or ethically skeptical in addition.
Or both in the case of the last 2.5 years. Right.
Right.
Interesting. Okay. So in terms of all that, there's a lot of complexity there, right? And part of what I've always found true about sort of governmental cover-ups, that's the stuff in movies, but often it very happens. Like things happen that are uncomfortable, people's reputations and careers on the line, and they'd rather just go away, right? That happens all the time. And sometimes it really is just life. Accidents happen, right? In this instance, I think there's a lot of really bad faith decisions were made that are not just, well, we tried the most, which is what the Atlantic article about amnesty is claiming. So what's the answer? I mean, is it we just need a Republican House and Senate that call hearings and we actually start to prosecute Fauci and the rest of them? I mean, what's the practical outcome to get to a state where those of us who are beyond infuriated at the damage these clowns did, some of them farther down the ranks were following orders, but some of them at the top made decisions that they knew were wrong. How do we get to those answers beyond the shadow of a doubt so that it doesn't feel like a political persecution? It really is, unlike January 6th, the musical. How do you actually find the truth of what happened without it appearing political and it really actually appearing? We want to find out objectively who did what when, so we never, ever, ever let this happen again.
Well, I think would be overwhelmingly difficult or impossible in its entirety. I think we have to pick, just like DAs have to pick winnable cases
Right.
and actionable things that are bad enough in daily life to bring to court. I think we have to pick the main leaders of the cabal who did this to us and to the world. And so even though a large fraction of doctors across the United States have done this to their patients, either not treated them or given them vaccines without informed consent, that I don't think that I would like to think that they should see some penalty for their cowardly behavior, but there are extenuating circumstances to some degree. The ones who went on television, who made statements that they knew to be factually untrue, that caused harm and damage, those are ones that we could consider to be actionable based on
Right.
that. But the main ringleaders of this need to be investigated and go to trial over it. And so, between Fauci and Collins and Burks and Jeremy Farrar, that's head of the Wellcome Trust
All
in,
right.
in England,
Right.
and Bill Gates, and the AMA as a whole, and the boards of medicine and family medicine and pediatrics and so on. All the individuals in those boards, all of that needs to be investigated. The basically where you draw the line is difficult to say. That
It's
the
very tricky
Nuremberg
because
trials.
people get caught up in the madness of crowds, right? I think about the UK example, especially that lunatic at Imperial College. The British killed like 10 million head of cattle and 9 million sheep on an idiotic lie that he promulgated 15 years prior. So they certainly learned nothing from their experience with this clown. And my overriding question here, but also my kind of overriding intent, because this has been so infuriating for 2 years, is I would love it if people were held accountable. More importantly than Burke sitting in a jail cell for 6 months, to me, is that there's an objective recounting that tells the history correctly, so that they're not allowed to declare victory. They're not allowed to say it worked, because they're trying it again with monkeypox. They're shoving these things out into the media. Monkeypox, that's kind of my goal. I would love the idea that some people are actually held to account. I highly doubt it's going to happen. What I would love to have is the ancillary knock-on effect of that, which is it's clear that this was a mistake. We should never do it again. Here's how we got here. How's the FDA was corrupted? I mean, if you had to choose, which would you like? A clear accounting that people understand, or Burke's in jail?
Well, I think we're going to get both eventually, but the problem is that the people in charge with the power get to write the history, and everything else is sum is done.
Right.
And we do have half the country, but we don't have half the media. And so, there's large numbers of books that are being written. Every week, somebody comes out with a new book on this. Bobby Kennedy's book is definitive on the massive amount of data and involvements. I recommend that on Fauci and the pandemic. Naomi Wolf's book on the bodies of others is a complement to that. It's definitive of what we went through as an accounting of what she, and by extrapolation, many other people went through during the pandemic, and how all the misrepresentations occurred at a human perception level. The Bregan's book, We Are the Prey, is a massive accounting of all of the fraud that was perpetrated on us in the name of science, and whose interests, were behind all of that. Aaron Kheriaty's book, that is just about to be out in the next week or two, is a similar one to Bregan's, looking at the misrepresentations, who stood to benefit, where all the political intrigue was, and so on. And there's many more books that have.
They're good sources for people to start to get a handle and to start to ignore. The parallel I draw in terms of, you're right about the media and the rest of it is, it was startling and fascinating to me to find, when I finally got to college, that FDR didn't save the country. He prolonged the Depression, and every single decision he made was disastrous. And the Great Depression should have lasted for 4 years instead of 11, right? So, but the history for years has been written by folks who leaned left, who loved government expansion, who loved the administrative state, and they managed to jam this fairy tale into the history books. FDR saved the country. Woo! No, we survived FDR, right? So if that lie has gone on for this many decades, hopefully those of us who are paying attention now can nudge the discussion far enough away so that we're not 80 years from now having kids come home from college and say, did you know that there was actually no pandemic? It was all government manufactured. So
Right.
hopefully we can do that.
Well, I think we have a problem because there's complete distrust of the CDC, FDA. Government. There's 21 doctors in Congress. How many of them stood up? One.
Yeah.
One, and in a very tepid way, until dealing with Fauci towards the end of 2 years of this. They have pharma money in their packs. They're unwilling to take a stand, just like most of the doctors across the country. We've been basically infiltrated by forces controlling everything in the government, that, and I'm not saying this is a conspiratorially.
Oh, that's nothing new. You
Right.
follow the money, and our very system
Right.
drives paying attention to those people that write you the biggest checks, and that is a massive error that people are trying to fix for good reasons and bad for a very long time. But it's obvious, yeah. If you're getting huge chunks of money from 50 executives from Pfizer, unless you're really convinced they're doing something really wrong, you're not going to say anything. Why would you? You like being a congressman.
Why? Because what you do is you go to another company and you basically play them off against each other, right? So that way you can tell each one, we appreciate your money, and I'm going to make the decisions that are best for that I think are best, and I've got money from such and such else. So you can try to buy me, and to some degree I'm sympathetic to your cause, but after all, I'm not threatened by it.
No. Well, there's that old great joke about an honest politician is one that stays bought.
Or that 6 feet underground.
Exactly. Was retired. Well, Harvey, thank you so much. This is fascinating. I deeply appreciate you taking the time. I'm going to leave a couple of links to your stuff below, and any kind of final words, final guidance aside from doubt everything anyone in government tells you until otherwise notified.
Okay, so let me just make a short disclaimer.
Sure.
Everything I've said so far has been about me as a scientist, epidemiologist, emeritus professor from Yale.
Right.
Now, I want to just switch to give full transparency. So I'm also involved in a startup medical healthcare company called The Wellness Company. It has a website. It's been up for about a month. It does telemedicine, sells supplements, gives a lot of medical information to members. It's relatively inexpensive. It's got a growing cadre of very highly competent doctors who will treat patients and not just send them home and say, when you get sick, go to the hospital. It's twc.health. That's my commercial for that.
And people can use that to also judge your intentions in terms of whether they should listen to what you have to say. So that's all
correct.
good.
Correct.
Right.
My conflicts of interest, right?
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate that. And to my listeners, thank you for tuning in. Remember to do yourselves the enormous favor of turning off the mainstream media who are lying to you and tune into Messy Times. Thanks so much.
Pleasure.
Learn what Bitcoin is, how it works, and why it matters. Bitcoin 101, your ultimate guide to the fundamentals of blockchain.